Hi, I'm Ryan Ferguson, and this is Predicting Redemption, analyzing the depiction of human nature and free will in video games. The research question that I'd like to present to you all today is, what does a depiction of human nature and free will in video games say about society as a whole? To do this, I will first be examining video games and their traditional depictions of free will. Then I will be examining human nature and the determinist and libertarian views on the subject. Then I will be looking at the Red Dead Redemption franchise's depiction of human nature. And then I will round things off with my conclusion. There is one particular style of video game that has always been associated with choice, that being RPGs or role-playing games. Role-playing games typically present choice in two different ways. There is the passive choice, which involves characters' proficiency in combat, or options that do not affect the story whatsoever, i.e. options such as adapting your character's abilities or increasing their stats, essentially things that do not have any effect on the story. Then there is active choice. Games such as Outer Worlds and Mass Effect allow players to assume the role of the character in conversations and directly interact with other characters in the world. Through this, players can actually influence the events of the world and can completely change the narrative based on their input. However, video games are mechanically limited in their ability to provide limitless outcomes. So, they either present two options. Choice is either a foundation of the game, or it's non-existent. Plot-driven games, such as Halo and Gears of War, essentially force a player to be an active bystander. You're participating in the events of the games, but you don't have any effect on what's actually happening, other than the guns you shoot and the things you kill, in examples like Halo and Gears of War. Essentially, they take agency away from the players while making them feel like they're a part of the events, causing them to perceive things the way that the characters do. Then there is the middle-of-the-road option that many choice-based RPGs pull, that being the binary choice option. In systems like the Paragon Renegade system featured in Mass Effect, essentially players are allowed to make choices, and these choices reward Paragon or Renegade points. Paragon representing the more idealistic hero, while Renegade is typically either evil or anti-heroic. The problem is that these points grant certain bonuses, such as additional dialogue choices and additional gameplay benefits. This artificially limits what players can do, because in order to get the special bonuses that they are encouraged to acquire, they have to make all Paragon choices or all Renegade choices. They essentially create a plot-driven narrative by encouraging specific outcomes, sometimes even outright ending the game and killing the main character if they don't choose all Paragon or all Renegade. This shows that most video games are rather limited in their ability to give weight to the choices the players make. Now we'll take a look at human nature and the determinist and libertarian views on the subject. When it comes to human nature, there are two primary opposing views on the subject. There's libertarianism, or free will, and then there is determinism, or cause and effect. Libertarianism is the concept that is founded in most societies. Essentially, it is founded on the idea of moral responsibility, the idea being that people are able to make choices of their own free will, and that people are likewise to be held accountable to their actions. Determinism, however, is the belief that human behavior can all be rationalized and explained based upon prior events. And it is of the belief that because humans don't really have any choice in, their choices, they don't have any responsibility over their actions because they can't influence them. Then there is the concept of personal narratives. Personal narratives are a concept that subconsciously limit human behavior. In an article by Martin Wells, he examined that human self-perception creates a false narrative. Essentially, the idea being people create conceptions about themselves. They either see themselves as honest and good or dishonest and manipulative, and they essentially constrain themselves into making choices that befit that narrative. Ultimately, however, this exhausts people and leaves them unhappy because they cannot fully rationalize and make choices based on all underlying external factors, and instead focusing specifically on what befits their conception of themselves. Martin Wells then observed that true happiness and fulfillment instead comes from breaking the narrative and becoming the awareness that forms it. Personal narratives also play a role in video games. Essentially, in an article written by Joe Alexander, he examined the character customization in many RPGs and analyzed that players would typically create characters that befitted their personal narrative, i.e., if they saw themselves as good and honorable, they would create a character and play it the way that they perceive themselves to be. If you were good and honorable, then you played as a knight. If you were dishonest and manipulative, you played as a thief. These personal narratives subconsciously form the basis of human and player behavior. Then there is human nature. Contrary to popular belief, human nature is not a firm doctrine, and is not a firmly set in stone set of rules. In Lisa Cahill's analysis of Aristotle's beliefs, she analyzed that human nature was an ever-changing idea. Essentially, Aristotle believed that human nature was inherently inclined towards goodness. However, she affirmed that belief, but not before analyzing how things had changed, i.e., slavery had been abolished and women's rights had been obtained, concepts that would have seemed taboo to human nature hundreds of years ago. Through this, she was able to prove that human nature is a constantly changing idea that is naturally inclined towards positive change. Then there is the Red Dead Redemption franchise's depiction of human nature. Red Dead Redemption is a game that focuses on the characters of Dutch, Arthur, and John Marston, although we will be examining Dutch and Arthur primarily. Dutch Vanderlinde is the leader of the Vanderlinde gang, of which Arthur Morgan is a part of, and also serves as Dutch's adopted son. The game takes place in 1899 during the end of the Wild West, and focuses on the events of the Vanderlinde gang trying to escape the government and evade the consequences of the Wild West ending. The game also features a binary choice system in where players that choose idealistic actions, or actions that befit an ideal hero, gain honor, and actions that are anti-heroic are dishonor. When it comes to personal narratives, they are abundant in this game. Dutch Vanderlinde paints himself as this Robin Hood type figure, a sort of messiah who will always lead the gang members who have faith in him to safety, and is fighting for a better and truer way of life. He uses this religious idealism of attaining a paradise for his gang to spur loyalty from his followers. But ultimately, this preconception is appealing to him only because it serves his massive ego. Arthur Morgan is almost the complete opposite in terms of his personal narrative. Due to his trauma, he sees himself as a bandit and only as deserving of such. He then makes decisions that paint himself in a negative light because that is what he views himself as. The loss of his family has made him jaded and cynical in his worldview, and to cope with his loss, he has decided to avoid moral responsibility and use self-deprecation to avoid it. Essentially, he makes it so that he believes that he doesn't have any say in the matter, and that ultimately, because the world is just the way it is, he doesn't deserve any better. The characters limit themselves in terms of behavior to fit their personal narrative. However, over the course of the game, their personal narratives are shattered due to trauma that they endure. In terms of Dutch Vanderland, he faces trauma by the slow and dawning realization that his gang is not only falling apart, but ultimately he is the cause of it. This trauma pushes him to the breaking point, and his paranoia ultimately serves to drive his gang away. And it serves to let his ego be manipulated by someone who knows Dutch's weaknesses and doesn't fall for his idealistic speeches. At the end of the game, Red Dead Redemption 2, his personal narrative is shattered, and in Red Dead Redemption 1, he is confronted by his former gang member, John Marston, and finds that he ultimately cannot escape his own shattered narrative.
We can't always fight nature, John. We can't fight change. Can't fight gravity. We can't fight nothing. My whole life, all I ever did was fight.
Then give up, Dutch.
But I can't give up, neither. I can't fight my own nature. That's a paradox, John. You see?
Dutch is of the mindset that human nature is something that cannot be broken, and that ultimately he can't adapt to the changing human nature. He ultimately decides that he is incapable of breaking from his own preconceptions. And in this remarkable bit of symbolism, gravity represents his personal narrative. And after coming to terms with it, he throws himself off the cliff. The personal narrative, represented by gravity, literally drags him down to his death. This shows that personal narratives ultimately serve only to drag people down into a lifestyle that not only makes them unhappy, but will let them die unhappy. However, Arthur can have a different response depending on players' choices using the binary choice system. Arthur Morgan faces trauma through his diagnosis of tuberculosis, effectively a death sentence in the days of the Wild West. His impending death sentence makes him question what is valuable to him, and he ultimately starts to gain awareness of the gang's situation and tries to get the gang to safety instead of following Dutch's half-brained schemes. And ultimately, depending on whether you are honorable or dishonorable, Arthur can either succumb to the narrative, dying alone in the camp, chasing after money that befits his narrative as a bandit, or, if you played honorably, you can overcome it. His fate is ultimately based on honor, dying capturing money, or dying saving his friends. He is ultimately able to understand and adapt to the changing Wild West.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
All aboard? I shall try.
In this dialogue between Arthur Morgan and Sister Mary, the line "take a gamble that love exists" is a direct correlation to the argument of free will versus determinism. Arthur defies his personal narrative, and instead of allowing gravity to take him, dies on the top of a mountain, defying gravity and consequentially his personal narrative. Arthur, depending on the choices the player makes, can achieve enlightenment and happiness by finally breaking his personal narrative. Now for the conclusion. Video games have adapted to portray more realism when it comes to human behavior, instead of trying to create limitless choice opportunities. Red Dead Redemption shows the effects of personal narratives and how they ultimately serve to drag people down. Instead of arguing with philosophers, it does not provide a definitive answer for whether free will is an existing concept, but instead shows that audiences should embrace the concept of free will, because in the choice between nothing mattering and everything mattering, people should choose the option of everything matters. Essentially, take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act. Here's my works cited. Thank you very much for watching.